Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Prestige Junkie Podcast. I am Katey Rich. I'm the awards editor here at The Ankler. And today, my co-host is a beloved podcast host of so many shows at The Ringer. But before any of that, she was my comrade at Vanity Fair and my friend, Joanna Robinson. Hello.
Katey Rich, what a thrill to be here in your new empire. I'm so excited.
My beautiful new virtual podcast studio that I'm so excited to welcome you into and reunite. We are going to talk movies, which I think will be hopefully fun for you since you're deep in the world of House of the Dragon in your regular job. But before we get to any of that, I want to tell you that later in the episode, you'll hear my conversation with Michael Sarnoski, who had a really great breakout hit in 2021 with a kind of thriller, kind of drama called Pigs, starring Nicolas Cage. And he has now leveled up majorly as the director of A Quiet Place Day One. So I'm excited to talk to him about that. But Joanna, we often like to talk about old movies amongst ourselves, and maybe someday we'll do a Philadelphia Story flashback. But for today, we have a 35th anniversary to celebrate. In the summer of 1989, Steven Soderbergh's first ever film, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and went on to open in theaters in August and become a pretty major independent film hit. It is a movie starring Andie MacDowell and James Spader and Peter Gallagher and Laura San Giacomo, all actors we love and will get to talk about. And Joanna, it's a major movie for film history, but also I didn't realize when I asked you to do this that you kind of have a deep personal attachment to it. So, Joanna, to start us off, what's your attachment to Sex, Lies, and Videotape?
Oh, that's so fun. That makes it sound like I'm like a little pervert who watched it in a room over and over again on videotape.
I'm sure plenty of people did.
I'm sure. I definitely watched it as a teenager. I had a friend growing up who would just bring us cinema, who was very important in curating my, who's here's Clerks, here's that. So definitely I absorbed it that way. And then really it was college when I took my first or maybe second film history course, and Sex, Lies, and Videotape is set up on the shelf as this, king of the independent cinema movement in the 90s. So, we watched this and then we watched a whole bunch of other 90s independent cinema. And I was really taken by this film. I think, knowing that you were going to ask me what my personal connection to it was, I think it's how theatrical it is, because sometimes I get critical of movies that feel like they're just plays, and there's certain ways in which this movie does, because it's, you basically have four members of the cast, 4 or 5 sets max. You're not going outside really. You're other than a stoop. We don't even have to film a driving scene. We can make an artistic choice to cut the driving scene, all this sort of stuff like that. So in that way, it feels like this, you could easily see this as a stage play, but then you add in the videotape element and then it becomes so centrally a cinematic experience. And so I think I love talkie films. I love films that feel like plays, but have sort of an elevated aspect to them that make them feel essentially cinematic. What about you, Katey? What's your Sex, Lies, and Videotape relationship?
I don't know if I have a personal history with it. I think I saw it after college, just kind of at one point being I'm going to check off these films. And I took an independent film class in college and didn't cover this movie for some reason. And I kind of, maybe it was too close to the 90s for it to become history, because that's how old I am. But it is so elemental.
You're younger than me. You're younger than me, for the record. Just to set the record straight. Okay, go ahead. Just
for our youthful listeners.
Yes.
But it is, you just see kind of the elements of so many 90s movies that come after that. I think I reread Peter Biskin's book, Down and Dirty Pictures, about Miramax and the 90s indie movies, which we'll talk about. And he kind of just referred to James Spader's character in this as a proto slacker. This is so before Richard Linklater, before Ben Stiller's making movies, all of those disaffected 90s movies. This comes out in 89. It's kind of technically a boomer movie, I guess. These people very much look like my parents and are basically the same age and time period. And Steven Soderbergh is born in 1963, but it just feels like it predicts so much of what's coming in the 90s. So I think I felt like I took it for granted as a film student, being like, oh, that was important for what it was. It really, kind of undeniably kicked off so many trends, but it doesn't seem that interesting to look back at. But it's so interesting to look back at. It really does stand on its own, even if you can kind of see all the imitators that have come after it while you watch it.
I love that. And I love that. I think that thinking of it as sort of essentially a Gen X movie is so interesting to me. And thinking about all the films that were loosely or directly or just like the talkiness of it and how much that inspired what came after it, I think is one of the most important legacies. But also just sort of the time period that it was 89. We're on the verge. We're leaving the 80s. We're headed into the 90s. There's something about the way it is titillating and also conservative at the same time, because sex and videotape are in the title, and like certainly some people are having sex in this movie, but like you're treated to like Laura San Giacomo's character from Collarbones Up, essentially. And like, I think the most nudity we get is Peter Gallagher with a houseplant, like covering him. Like that's it. And so
that houseplant.
doing some work. But like, I think that it's such a fascinating way to draw people in, to say sex and videotape in the title of a movie to draw people in. And then also when you walk out of that movie, you could recommend that movie to like your mom anyway, like I think that's a really fascinating aspect of it. Not a cynically intentional aspect of it from Soderbergh's perspective, I think, but that's part of the juice behind it, I swear.
So the thing about the title is so interesting because as far as I can tell from reading Peter Biskind's book is that Steven Soderbergh had given it that title from the very beginning. He brings it to Sundance. He premieres it at like some crappy theater where like half the people, don't know what they're going to see. He was like debating changing the title with the people in the audience after the screening. And it became really one of the first examples of like a big word of mouth Sundance hit, which we still talk about now, where people at the festival are like, you got to go see this. You got to get your ticket. And that is where the Weinsteins pick it up from Miramax. And that, you imagine this title as being like, oh, that's a Weinstein thing. They would just want to sell the sex, which they absolutely did. But it is, to me, it shows Steven Soderbergh, even from the very beginning, this is his first film. He's 26 years old, kind of getting that high-low thing that he's done his whole career, like understanding that you can have something with a provocative title and still be really interesting. And both those things can exist at once. It's like an Ocean's movie done from the very beginning of his career.
Totally. And I think that I knew that you were sort of going through Down and Dirty Pictures. So I picked up John Pearson's Spike, Mike, Slackers, and Dykes, which is another great sort of book about the early 90s independent cinema boom, or it goes from like mid 80s to mid 90s essentially is what he's covering. And like he describes, he was there on the ground, of course, at Sundance, and he describes like people were coming to Sundance because there was this huge second wave at that festival, sort of unheard of, because the word of mouth was so strong even outside of the town. It wasn't just like people who were at the festival who had missed it went to the second or third or fourth viewing. He said, the Holiday Cinemas, which is like, the actual movie theater in Park City, which is like one of the crappier venues currently, with love and respect to the Holiday, but like one of the smaller venues currently. But I think at the time, because it was just like an actual movie theater, was like one of the main places. He said that they were scalping tickets for Sex, Lies, and Videotape outside of that movie, and that he snuck Tom Rothman in personally, like into the screening, the fourth screening of Sex, Lies, and Videotape at Sundance.
That's a good
it's
flex.
wild, and I think that it changed, like, I think that FOMO idea of like, you don't want to miss the thing that's going to become the next Sex, Lies, and Videotape, I think changed the way people go to Sundance, because I think that idea of like people having to scurry to catch up in the back half of the festival, and so many people lost out to Miramax and Sex, Lies, and Videotape, or didn't even think it was maybe worth bidding on. But then when you do the math later, and it's like, what is it, like a $1.2 million budget with like a, what is $30-something million return, that's spinning straw into gold. That then becomes this like fear of like, we can't miss the next Sex, Lies, and Videotape at Sundance. Like, we have to go. It has to happen. So it changes the reputation of the festival, I think, forever.
Well, that's something that the Biskind book does kind of throughout, is link Sundance and Miramax as kind of these two forces of the 90s independent film. And Sex, Lies, and Videotape is a perfect meeting of the two of them. Like before that comes there, Sundance is known for these really like granola-y, like American heartland movies. Like there's some description in the book about it being like a farmer gazes into the sunset and chews on a stalk of wheat and stamps out a cigarette. And that's what they were. And so at that festival, Sex, Lies, and Videotape didn't win the jury prize. It went to a different kind of more righteous movie, I think, because this movie is provocative and it's about yuppies. And it's not really like, I don't think maybe you can tell me differently, like about a larger like human condition thing. And so I like that it's kind of being underestimated by awards happened from the very beginning, but the real prize came later and was so much bigger than any award could have been.
Yeah, and it won the audience prize. So then, like,
yes.
I think that also then starts to, you know, similar to the way that you and I for years and years talked about the audience prize at TIFF as being like a bellwether, like this idea of the audience prize as some sort of bellwether or something to come. And my understanding, again, you know, who knows exactly, but that the Weinsteins saw that audience prize popularity, and it's part of why their strategy was to push Sex, Lies, and Videotape beyond the art house into, you know, into a wider release. Like people in the suburbs will enjoy Sex, Lies, and Videotape sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, they released it in August kind of as counter programming to summer blockbusters, and it absolutely worked and people went to see it. But before that, like it did something which I don't even know if you're allowed to do anymore. So it had won a prize at Sundance. It had been seen. And then it goes and plays in competition at Cannes and wins the Palme d'Or, which I cannot think of a current, you know, usually that's like a world premiere at Cannes that wins that now.
Right.
But the thing that I just can't get over, and I think, you know, history can't get over, is that it's there at the same time as Do the Right Thing. Like these two massive landmark, and Do the Right Thing is being made by a studio. It's not quite the same history, but these landmark films, and Sex, Lies, and Videotape wins the Palme d'Or over Do the Right Thing. I think I might say it shouldn't have gone that way, but also history panned out the way that it did. Just like what a history colliding in that exact moment.
Well, I mean, we're going to come back to that duo when we talk about the Oscars, obviously, but like I think it's such an interesting moment because would you say this is yes, this is definitely before the Weinsteins figure out how to game the Oscars.
Yeah, they're figuring it out. Well, at the same time, they have My Left Foot. So at the same Oscars, they've got Daniel Day-Lewis cleaning up and Brenda Fricker. So it's like kind of the twin poles of Miramax right there, right? Like the provocative, genuinely great American indies. And then, no offense to My Left Foot, but you kind of the heartstring tugging Oscar bait thing. They were kind of doing them both at the same time.
But the strategy behind Sex, Lies, and Videotape at Cannes is interesting because, you know, according to John Pearson's book, like the conventional wisdom would be to put that film in the director's fortnight. And I think that's because Steven Soderbergh is like a first-time director. When Spike was there for She's Gotta Have It, like his first Cannes film, it was in the director's fortnight. You know, like that's where you would put a film like this at the time. And the Weinsteins really wanted it in main competition. And so they were like leveraging the various factions against each other into essentially the Cannes version of a bidding war. And Wim Wenders is the head of the jury that year, and he's like, Mookie and Do the Right Thing isn't a hero, blah, blah. And Spike's like, I don't know, is James Spader's character a hero? Like, what are you talking about? Who's heroic in Sex, Lies, and Videotape? So yeah, question. That's the beginning. Obviously, like, Spike's second year at Cannes being like feeling snubbed and frustrated about it. He'll do it again with Jungle Fever, and then like, you know, we'll go on to be the head of the jury. Like his whole Cannes journey is completely fascinating. But this win for Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and this win for James Spader, I think crucially at Cannes, he's never nominated for an Oscar ever. That's like terrible. But
well, he kind of went and just made a fortune on television also after this. So in some ways, he took himself out of the running.
He's got 3 Emmys on his mantle. That's true. But like, I think that, you know, it is eternally frustrating for Spike, everything that happened to him this year. And it is instrumental to the legacy of Sex, Lies, and Videotape. And Do the Right Thing has an equally large legacy from the same year. So, yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, so that Best Actor one, I feel like we haven't like talked too much about what's happening in the movie itself. Like I have not seen most of the other movies that are in competition at Cannes that year, except for Do the Right Thing. But it's just such a huge, again, like kind of a generational performance. Like it's like the essence of James Spader, but not when anyone knew that was the essence of James Spader. Like he is so captivating. He's not in as much in the movie as you think he is. He like disappears for a long stretch, but his shadow looms over the whole thing. I just think that's such a great win. And it doesn't surprise me that the Oscars of that period couldn't get on board with it, but it feels like exactly the right call for Cannes.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's because it's one of those moments where you're watching an actor who filmgoers were already familiar with as playing a very certain type, the like, you know, yuppie, sneering menace that he had played in, you know, Wall Street or Pretty in Pink or whatever, you know, pick your pleasure, Less Than Zero. And so this idea, you know, I was reading this old LA Times interview that Spader gave in '89 where they were like, what on earth made you pick this movie? And he essentially was talking about, essentially, it was after he won the prize at Cannes. And he was essentially like, well, when I was doing publicity on whatever his last yuppie sneering role was, the journalist kept asking me if I was afraid of being typecast. He's like, I wasn't until you started asking me all the time. And he's like, and my agent sent me this script and he was like, everyone's afraid to do this. And so I said, okay, then I want to do it. And Spader, I think, you know, with love and respect to Andie MacDowell, Peter Gallagher, and Laura San Giacomo, like he was the biggest name, and none of them were huge names, but he was the biggest name on the project. And I think him being attached did a lot to pique people's interest in it, but they didn't know that he could do this. So like, yeah, you know that moment when an actor does something, you're like, well, I didn't know you had that in your tool bag. And then James Spader's like, watch me make this my entire personality for the rest of my career. It's a fascinating moment.
It's also like that character is such a director stand-in in, you know, not in autobiographical ways, but kind of a guy who like is behind the camera and he can't live the life that he's capturing. And that's not something you think about Soderbergh for really the rest of his career. Like his movies aren't especially about him or even about filmmaking, but like it's such a canny way to tell a story for your first movie. Like to me, that just feels like even more evidence that like even if an autobiographical film is a pretty standard first film, it's such an interesting way to approach that. Like he just got it from the very beginning. Like Steven Soderbergh was like born understanding how film structure works. So that's how that character makes me feel.
Well, it's wild to me because in doing like, you know, whatever the medium dive that I did to prep for this podcast, I saw that a couple times, this idea of this film being autobiographical, which I never considered. I didn't know that Soderbergh had, you know, spent some of his childhood and his college years in Baton Rouge. I didn't like know that he considered it like apparently in like earlier press, he talked more about it being autobiographical. And then I think he very wisely stopped talking about that because he's like, the James Spader character, my past as being a pathological liar, blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. My need for the remove of the camera, you know, in order to enjoy intimacy, like all of that sort of stuff. He stopped talking about that. And I think that's smart because then it becomes a movie that everyone can find a way, hopefully, to find a way to relate to, rather than like, this is my story about myself. But yeah, I had never, I mean, obviously there's ways in which this is a movie about the art of making movies, which we know all awards bodies tend to enjoy to some degree or another. So this is like, what can cinema do? It can unlock like new levels of intimacy or honesty or what can the camera do? Like that's obviously part of this film. But the idea that the specificity of like Baton Rouge or his own personal romantic background or whatever it is, that sort of erased itself from the film's legacy, but is definitely part of it, you know?
Yeah. I mean, the fact that it's set in Baton Rouge does allow for Andie MacDowell to use her native South Carolina accent. She grew up very close to where I grew up. And I think it is perfect and wonderful. And I think she's so good in this. Like, I don't know where we are in the Andie MacDowell, like, appreciation train. I feel like it goes back and forth. And now Margaret Qualley's out there being like, no, actually remember how much you like Andie MacDowell. But I just think she's so great in this. And so, like, it just feels like exactly like who this person would be living in Baton Rouge in the late 80s.
She's very like Nancy Kerrigan core.
There's the hair. Just really everyone in this movie has incredible hair. Incredible hair.
Absolutely. The feathering is just in full effect. No, it's really funny. Like Andie using her native accent and then Laura San Giacomo trying to like match it, but landing somewhere like kind of in Texas is pretty funny. But
I know.
But I think this, and then I would say like her performance, whatever it was 2 years ago in Maid, opposite Margaret Qualley, are my two favorite Andie MacDowell performances. Like, or throw Magic Mike in there and make it a threefer. But like, I think this is the best she ever does in this era of her career. I like Green Card. I love Four Weddings and a Funeral, but she's not like necessarily the highlight of those movies. But I think she's really, really good in this. And it's so funny that you mentioned Margaret Qualley, because I just watched Driveway Dolls like very recently. And this is the first time I've watched an Andie MacDowell performance, and I've really seen so much of her daughter in her, or vice versa. I think it's because Margaret Qualley is now of the age that Andie MacDowell was when she like kind of started making movies, and before that, she looked. I could kind of see it. I really saw it when I rewatched this movie the other day. It's really there in like the mouth, especially. It's fascinating.
So awards-wise, Spader wins Best Actor at Cannes, and that's kind of the end of him getting awards as far as I could tell. But Andie MacDowell got a Golden Globe nomination, as did Larson Giacomo. She shared Best Actress at LAFCA, LA Film Critics, with Michelle Pfeiffer. And I think the idea is that Laura had been kind of like the strongest contender, like in supporting actress, which you can kind of imagine, like, if you're up against like, Jessica Tandy and Driving Miss Daisy, who goes on to win, like it's just, Andie MacDowell's role is not that kind of like movie driving actress performance. Yeah. And so then the only nomination winds up being for Best Original Screenplay again. I mean, have you looked at that like Best Original Screenplay lineup from the 89 Oscars? Because I have it in front of me. I can just read it out loud.
Yeah, read it out.
Okay, so it's Crimes and Misdemeanors by Woody Allen, Do the Right Thing, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and When Harry Met Sally, all of which lose to Dead Poet Society. I haven't watched Dead Poet Society in a while. I feel really mad about that, reading this right now.
It's funny because thinking about, I love Dead Poet Society. I love that movie. It is probably of all those, actually barring When Harry Met Sally, like the most quoted movie, Oh, Captain, My Captain, like Carpe Diem, Sound Your Barbaric Y'all. I guess a lot of those are actual just poetry quotes. But like, I think that it's quotability, it's very Oscar friendly in like just the most straightforward way you could possibly think of. So it's one of those moments, but like story wise, I genuinely love that movie, but story wise, the enduring quality of Do the Right Thing, When Harry Met Sally, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, the Woody Allen it's like, a slightly lesser Woody Allen, but like, I just think that, please don't come for me, Crimes and Misdemeanor fans. That it's, I'm not out. I think the reason I'm not outraged, and this is the benefit of the long history of the Oscars, is I'm like, well, we know that Steven Soderbergh eventually gets his Oscar Day in the Sun. We know that Spike eventually gets his like big Oscar narrative moment, though he deserves more than he currently has on his shelf, I would say. Like,
the fact that it was the same year as Green Book, the Driving Miss Daisy Green Book bookends of Spike Lee's career. I just never get over. Yeah. It's crazy that happened twice.
Well, totally. But this is part of it, is that, the question is, are we mad that Sex, Lies, and Videotape didn't do better at the 90s Oscar, at the 1994, 1989 Oscars? And I was thinking about it. I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was telling him that I was coming on the show to talk to you about that and thinking about this. And he's like, well, what year is that? And I was like, oh, it's the Driving Miss Daisy year. And we both went like, oh. And I think that if history had been, if the Oscars had been more receptive to Sex, Lies, and Videotape and been more responsive to the movement that was that film that year, then we would be saying, oh, it's the Sex, Lies, and Videotape year, and be going, oh, that would like really ding the legacy of that film, because the optics of that, 4 white people navel gaze about sex over Do the Right Thing, is maybe would earn it the same reputation that Driving Miss Daisy, a film that like is pretty innocuous if it hadn't, edged Do the Right Thing out. Has earned since. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's better for Sex, Lies, and Videotape in the long run that it had this like Cannes moment, but a muted Oscars experience, and then has just gotten to hold on to its legacy as the start of a revolution in film.
Well, and that's like the two separate poles of loving the Oscars, I think. And this is something we both experience is you want to push them. You want them to expand. You want them to be able to embrace things. You want Parasite to win Best Picture and to have these exciting moments. But also, you know, they're going to be the Oscars and you know that they are going to be themselves. And part of the joy is in figuring out who they are and in like seeing their blind spots and knowing what they're going to be and knowing that history is going to prove that many of the best films ever made never won Oscars and that that's okay. I think that tension is what I like to live in, honestly, of like knowing some things will go good and some things will go badly. And at the end of the day, you know, the better movies will eventually rise to the top one way or another.
It's funny, though, when you wonder like where else we could have seen nominations. I like that you pulled out Laura as like the likeliest there. And whenever I think about, oh, if this actor had gotten nominated, who do I kick out of the category, right? That's the math you have to consider. And I think it's pretty easy for me to kick, with love and respect to the eventual Steven Soderbergh leading Lady Oscar winner Julia Roberts. It's pretty easy for me to kick Julia Roberts and Steel Magnolias out of that category for Laura.
Yes, because you know that Pretty Woman is coming the next year. Like, it's going to happen no matter what for her.
Actress wise, that's a much harder category for me to reckon with because I have not seen 3 of the 5 performances. So, you know, I can't really do the math there. Actor is actually tremendously hard because it's Daniel Day-Lewis and Mila Foot, as you mentioned. And like, he's really, really good in that movie. It's Kenneth Branagh and Henry V, and that was the start of its own like movement. It's very important in cinema of the 90s. Tom Cruise, Born on the 4th of July. Tom Cruise really trying something in Born on the 4th of July. Morgan Freeman and Driving Miss Daisy, and Robin Williams, The Dead Poets Society. I think I kicked Cruise out, but it's a harder category to find a space for Spader in there.
Yeah.
So
I've never seen Born on the 4th of July, but I always love a movie star doing something different. No, I mean, that's Erin Brockovich again, and go back to Julia Roberts.
Yeah.
Like, when our biggest stars go for it and do something that actually works out, we reward them. No, you're totally right that that's a really a tough one to break into. Because it's not like Driving Miss Daisy has this, you know, reputation. And there's a lot of like 80s Oscar-y bait, like, no offense to Enemies, a Love Story or A Dry White Season or Music Box or these movies I haven't seen, but they all kind of fit in that box of like serious 80s adult movies that like really dominated the Oscars in that period. But there's a lot of really good stuff in here too that you don't want to kick out. Again, the Oscars get it right more often than not, at least in terms of who they nominate, I would say.
Well, there's just often too many deserving people for the number of slots.
Yeah.
I always feel like, would it be interesting to you, prestige junkie expert Katey Rich, if should the Oscars start doing a like 20 years later nostalgia Oscar? I feel like they should. They should do like 20 years later.
Who did we not?
Like a legacy.
Yeah.
Not like we got it. They don't have to say we got it wrong because that's admitting too much like fault in their own system, but just sort of like the legacy Oscar. Like which movie this year that didn't win anything or wasn't even nominated for anything or whatever, like has had the most impact on the industry or on storytelling. You know what I mean? It's like a positive spin where you don't have to be like, we fucked up, but it's like, you know, the long lens of history is always interesting to look at.
So it's not like the honorary awards where it's like, all right, Angela Bassett, we know that we owe you an Oscar by now. We haven't gotten you one, so we're going to give you an honorary award. But it's for like the movie itself. Like you get Do the Right Thing an Oscar for like accomplishment in
its
excellence.
Impact.
Yeah. I love that idea. I thought you were going to bring up the idea of the also-rans, like who was in 6th and 7th place for nominations, which is something I dream of all the time, that they would like give us the numbers one of these days. I don't think that'll ever happen, but I want it so bad.
Katey, I think we need to like infiltrate Price Waterhouse or something like this. And I think we need a Steven Soderbergh-esque Ocean's 11 heist of you and me. I don't know what my addition is to a heist team, but I dare you to have an Oscar heist without me to like crack the Price Waterhouse system so we can get all the stats that we ever wanted.
See, this is why we use the summer to do Oscar flashbacks and other nonsense, because like it's a slow season for awards movies. We like run out of things to talk about. We come up with some of our best ideas when we don't think they're coming. So yes, I'm in full support.
Excellent. Who makes the movie about the attempted Oscar heist that we will surely get arrested for?
I mean, you said Steven Soderbergh. Like, are you really going to try to do better than that?
Yeah, but it's also like, is this a Christopher Guest movie also? You know what I mean? What's the vibe? What are we doing here?
I'm just imagining the, like, you remember the Price Waterhouse guy who messed up the envelopes, who like looked vaguely enough like Matt Damon that people made it a thing.
Oh, yes.
So like you bring Matt Damon in from the Ocean's world, like you connect the dots there. But you know, I feel like we can dream bigger. Maybe it is too absurd to be anything but well, like the Informant style Steven Soderbergh. How about that?
Correct.
Okay. So we wrap it up. Everyone should see Sex, Lies, and Videotape, I think.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just important cinema history. It's a good time. It's fun to watch. Like, it's short. It's impressive when you realize it was made on how little money. It really kind of has the whole package.
But please have fun counting the sets, because it's like genuinely like three houses,
a really 80s office. Yep. Laura San Giacomo's great artsy apartment with all that bamboo furniture. None of the chairs work. Amazing. But it's great furniture.
Yeah, I mean, let's shout out. We mentioned all the other, like, Peter Gallagher is great in this movie great. and is essential to this movie. He just has to play like the worst character that you're definitely not rooting for. So, but he's really in classics yuppie scumbag mode here. I love that for him. So
speaking of Oscar bookends, I love that he started the decade as this guy and then ends it as the as in American Beauty as the real estate scumbag. Like, he really kind of completed the arc before the 90s were over.
It's so funny. So something you had sort of asked me to consider, we didn't spend time on it, and that's okay. But like, what are the films that are inspired by Sex, Lies, and Videotape or The Imitators? And like, we don't need to go through it, but at one point I did write down on my notes like American Beauty ? Because basically of like Wes Bentley and his video camera and the plastic bag. Like, I don't know if anyone who made that movie would cite Sex, Lies, and Videotape directly, but
yeah. Well, I would love, maybe this is where we can get the listeners to weigh in. You can email me. I don't know if Joanna doesn't want to be emailed, but I'm at Katey@theankler.com, or you can tweet at us with telling us about your favorite Sex, Lies, and Videotape. It's, children, basically, not just every 90s movie. We would love to hear from all of you. And in the meantime, Joanna, thank you so much for taking a break from your endless Westeros deep dives over at The Ringer to talk to me about the movies.
What a delight. I love talking about movies. I love talking about movies with you. And I love talking about, you're the only person I love talking about the Oscars with, because you both get it. You both you're such an unusual person. This is why you're perfect for this current job, because you love the Oscars and also understand how ridiculous the Oscars can be at the same time. You contain those multitudes. This is why you're the best.
They go hand in hand, always and forever. Now let's hear my conversation with Michael Sarnoski. He's a writer and director who is following what has become a pretty familiar pattern in recent years. He made a low-budget, critically acclaimed indie that was Pig, which came out in 2021. And John Krasinski saw it and asked Sarnoski to take on an expansion of the Quiet Place franchise. But the twist this time is that A Quiet Place Day One feels like a Michael Sarnoski movie, way more than you'd ever expect. It's a studio film, but not one that has swallowed up its up-and-coming director. That feels kind of like a miracle these days, and I was excited to talk to Sarnoski about how he pulled that off. A Quiet Place Day One is an alien invasion movie that's also really personal and thoughtful and has great lead performances from Lupita Nyong'o and Joseph Quinn. So let's hear how it happened in my conversation with the writer and director of A Quiet Place Day One, Michael Sarnoski. So, Michael, we're talking on Friday. The movie has opened on Thursday night. I went and saw it in my multiplex Thursday night. There's some early numbers coming in, which suggests it's going to do pretty well. I know when you make a big would-be summer blockbuster, there's a lot of pressure, but this summer's been kind of rough. There's been so much panic about the box office. How have you been coping with that level of pressure put on you and your movie, or do you just pretend it's not happening?
I mean, I mostly pretend it's not happening. I mean, I've sort of been doing that with lots of things along the way. Like you come onto a big franchise, people have big expectations. I just kind of have to not think about it. I mean, I think it probably manifests as night terrors and like an upset stomach, but like consciously I try to avoid it and just repress it as much as possible. So, that's sort of, I mean, I don't have that much control over it. I only like sort of care about, like I care about that, but it's not really it's not the activity that I'm engaged in. Like what I'm trying to do is just make something that I do care about with characters I care about, and all this other stuff. I have to like, if I'm constantly trying to react to what people expect or what people want from something, I'm going to be just having a miserable time and not really, I won't be doing something that's kind of true to me or exciting to me. Obviously, like you have to take that stuff into account to a certain extent, but I try to avoid it as much as possible.
Is there any sense of relief now that it's out there and people are seeing it and liking it? Or did that relief come months ago when you finished it? Or is there no relief to be had at all?
I don't know. I've gone through phases. I mean, when we finished it, I remember I went through like it was hard to make this movie. Like it was 2.5 years of my life. It was a big movie. It's, there's so many hurdles that you have to get through. And I remember when I finished the movie, there was kind of like a grieving period of like, I've poured myself into something for so long. And then the grieving period kind of turned into like a little bit of a numb, like, wow, it's over. Now I'm just kind of, I have to do press and all that sort of stuff. But at this point, like I've sort of done what I can. I'm in that weird phase now where it's like, I had control over many elements of this thing for such a long time. And now suddenly in the moment when everyone's talking to me about it and everyone's forming their own opinions on it, I'm suddenly like I have the least control I've ever had in the process. So it's just, you're just kind of in this like, here you go. Like, I don't know. It's a lot of different emotions that I'm still kind of trying to figure out what the sort of healthy way to approach them is. But yeah, it's strange.
I think some directors spend their entire careers figuring out the healthy approach. So, you got time. You'll get there someday. To rewind back to when this started, you said that John Krasinski approached you and said you wanted to bring kind of the sensibility of Pig to this franchise. How did you know that he meant what he meant by that and that he meant what you thought Pig was? Like, how did you know that meant you could collaborate and not just like he wanted you to do something that's not at all what you thought you wanted to? Where does that start?
I mean, again, it was one of those, you just don't think about it too hard. Like for me, what made Pig special to me was I wrote something for myself that I knew I cared about and I understood and I wanted to explore. So at its core, that was what I wanted to do with Quiet Place was, kind of go into a world that wasn't mine, but find characters and a story that felt like me and felt like something that I wanted to spend time with and explore. I think, I think there are definitely commonalities you could draw and say like, oh, okay, so you're into, surprisingly emotional stories with unexpected protagonists or, all these sort of different ideas. But I kind of had to like not think about what John meant by that and just focus on what he's telling me is do something that you care about and make this your own. And so that's kind of what I focused on was, okay, if I were to do this thing, what would I want to do with it? And I just had to sort of make everything based off of that.
It occurred to me about halfway through the movie that you had done this fascinating reversal where the characters in the first two movies have everything on the line. They're protecting their families. There's so much emotional stakes. And you created a protagonist who in some ways has nothing to lose. Like that's what drives her through this film. Was that essential to you to flip the motivations of the central characters to make it your own? Was that part of how you built this main character of Sam to differentiate her from the family in the first two films?
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the first idea was when he told me they wanted to do a day one New York City movie. And initially, I kind of was thinking like, I don't know if I have anything to bring to that genre. I feel like we've seen that before. We've seen sort of like city disaster movies. And like, I think I wasn't sure if there was an in for me. And I thought about it over the weekend and I was kind of going through all the lists of things I didn't want to see. Like I didn't want some movie about a bunch of soldiers trying to fight the aliens. I didn't want some story about, a family trying to like rescue their kids and get out of the city. I mean, all those can be very like moving and intense, but I just felt like I had seen those sorts of things. And then I kind of came to this thought of like, at their core, a lot of these movies tend to be about survival. Like what if our character didn't even really want to survive? And I think that's putting yourself in like a tricky spot as a writer to be like, is there a way to make a compelling story in what is a survival franchise? Like even more than a horror movie, like the first movies are kind of like apocalyptic survival movies. And And mostly it was like, if I could think of something that I found compelling and a character in a story I found compelling where that wasn't even the goal, then I could get behind this. And that's sort of where Sam came from, was, okay, what if I've been reading a book about hospice, and I was like, well, what if this was a hospice patient who kind of already had in some ways made her peace with her death, and then like, how would then the end of the world, kind of reflecting that death that she's been dealing with, how would that affect her? What would her journey be? What would her goal be? And it would sort of be like smaller and more personal than what a lot of other people are going through. And that sort of thinking started exciting me and getting me into it. I think it's sort of like a risky character to follow, because you're really taking away a lot of the crutches of what people find exciting about these sorts of movies. Mm-hmm. But I think that was kind of my challenge that I wanted to go for, and see if I could find something that really spoke to me.
Was pizza pretty quickly the mission because of the New York setting, or were there other things that Sam would be searching for before you got to pizza?
Pizza was pretty quick. I mean, it was just like, just something about, what if she was just a dying person who wants to get a last slice of pizza? Like that just felt really right for New York City. I think early on I remember saying that, and there was this kind of sense of like, oh, that's a fun idea, but like, I'm sure we'll find something like better than pizza, like, the grave of her child or something, or like, sure. But I don't know. There was something about that pizza thing that just stuck. And then it was kind of about diving into her character and figuring out kind of what that pizza meant to her and what it grows to mean. But I liked the simplicity of it. I think people get that. I think people respond to that. I think there's a risk of people feeling like, come on, I'm not going to watch a movie about someone going to get pizza. But I think there's something very like fundamental that we all kind of relate to a little bit in that. I think it's a little bit coming out of the pandemic. We've sort of seen what it feels like to have the world sort of falling apart around you, and you just want to like bake your bread. And so I think that kind of primed people to sort of understand this, like, you get your pizza.
Are there other movies that you kind of look to as being like, no, the goal can be low stakes as long as it's meaningful? I mean, Pig, honestly, like trying to get your pig back feels like that way, but I didn't know if there was something else that you looked to saying you could pull this off. I think that's just always been something that I'm interested in, is like going smaller instead of bigger. And I think that was kind of the fun challenge of this one, where like in a movie that kind of does promise to go bigger, like, can we scratch that itch of going bigger and having the set pieces and the excitement, but on an emotional level get really like small and intimate? Yeah. I think it's just something I kind of love. I mean, I think there are movies that do it great. Like, I remember when working on Pig, I was thinking a lot about like Nebraska. And I think there are movies that kind of go simple, and there's something beautiful about that. But I wasn't really like thinking too much about anything specifically. The only reference I would talk about sometimes was Children of Men. The cinematographer and I would talk about that, just because of the kind of like sense of presence and kind of boots on the ground nature of the action in that, and of that story. It's like you just really feel like you're kind of with this character as this crazy world is happening around them. And then there was always sort of like an element of, on an intellectual level, talking about aliens, just this idea of what was it kind of contained more horror movie. Suddenly you're promising something bigger and more action driven. But I think we were less trying to like emulate aliens and sort of play with like what that, like, does it have to be like, Aliens is great, but like, I didn't see it as I was making a giant action movie, but that is sort of like the promise of this movie. And we have to like do that, but is there a way to do that, but still tell like a sort of offbeat small story? Yeah, I feel like I haven't seen Children of Men in a while, but like in the very beginning, Clive Owen's like getting coffee while the world is collapsing around him, and he's just getting that coffee. Like that feels like a very similar character to Lupita Nyong'o in this one. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, and I think in some ways we can relate to that. Like we all want to think of ourselves as like the hero who's going to kill all the aliens or whatever. But I mean, at the end of the day, we are just kind of trying to like find our humanity and remain ourselves and love the things that we love as it feels like the world is crumbling.
Yeah. I mean, when you take on a big movie like this, like they always say the job of a director is just to answer questions all day. You've got people asking you what to do. And you also have to make time to connect with your actors and like put them at the center of it. And this movie has so many close-ups, so many deep emotional actor moments. What do you have to change about how you work with actors when you level up on a movie like this? Or what do you have to not change to make it work?
I mean, mostly with every person on set, I tried to not change much at all. Like, yes, our crew is 4 times as big, probably more than that sometimes as Pig. But like, I kind of just wanted to create the same sort of vibe that we had on Pig. Like I wanted to sort of make it feel like an indie movie on a very large scale. So, you talk to everyone respectfully, calmly, you listen a lot. I think, the job of the director is to answer a lot of questions, but it's also to listen a ton, be like, okay, what do people have to offer? What do people want to suggest? What are people feeling? It's just a lot of conversations. And I think having just kind of like calm, respectful conversations is sort of how you accomplish it. So I tried to approach it pretty much the same way as Pig. We just had a lot more to do and a lot more people doing it.
Yeah. So is there an example you can think of with Lupita Nyong'o or Joseph Quinn where they're kind of having that conversation back and forth with you, like what they're doing to create these characters in the midst of everything going on around them?
Yeah, it's kind of constant. Like that is what you're doing on set, and that is directing is, step one for me is always the script. Like that's kind of 80% of directing. It's like, here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm thinking for the characters. What would you like to bring to them? How can you wrap your head around this? Then you get on set and I usually let people kind of do a take first without really talking about it much at all. And then you start breaking down, like, okay, so what are we thinking here? And do we want to like emphasize this moment a little more? But that's kind of every day. You kind of are just like talking through these scenes and reimagining them. Once I get on set, you always kind of like have the script there, but I'm very precious about the script in the writing phase. And then I kind of throw it out a little bit and just say, okay, like how are we feeling in this moment? What are we trying to achieve? But yeah, I think on set is just a constant conversation. Yeah. That's kind of what our jobs are.
What does it mean to kind of throw out the script and experiment with something when you actually get there? And how do you get away with that without causing total chaos on a giant movie?
Not like throw out like,
sure.
We're going to completely change the movie, but it's like, I don't get precious about the dialogue. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's a line that just like has to be the way it is. But like we can cut lines, we can change how people are interacting in ways like, I also just kind of like, I think by the time I get to set, I know it well enough that I'll remember the important stuff and all the little things that you're trying to do by saying this and that. Like, you say a look that they do and you realize, oh, actually that look should happen in a totally different spot. And Lupita has found the perfect spot for that look. And so it's just about like not trying to be so precious that you're like, wait a minute, this wasn't how I had initially thought about it. You just have to like watch the performance and say, am I feeling the thing that I want to be feeling? And is this happening and accomplishing the thing that needs to be accomplished? So it's mostly just like, I don't get really nitpicky about that stuff. I just like to sort of see what we're experiencing. But also at that point, it's just so ingrained in my head that I kind of know what we need to achieve. Yeah. So we can have a little bit of leeway there. And if someone says like, hey, I feel like I should say it this way, usually unless it's like an extremely important, like, it needs to be this for some very important reason. Usually if I'm like, hey, if that feels more natural to you, that is the way you should be saying it. Absolutely.
There's also so many moments where nothing's being said, but it's someone's eyes saying, why would you do this? Or I'm not going with you, or I am going with you. And I imagine it's part of editing, of telling the audience what the context is. But is that the actors giving you like a 10-degree more narrowed eyes? Like, are you doing versions and versions of that so that you can kind of read exactly what we're going to need to see as an audience?
Not usually. Sometimes there's some like micro eyeline. It's like, no, you need to like look there really quickly because there's a thing happening. But usually I don't get into that sort of thing. Also I'm really lucky because I'm working with extremely talented actors who really have a sense of how they're being read on camera. But yeah, sometimes you say like, oh, don't stand this way because the angle we're looking at you, that reads as something else or whatever. But not that often. Like they're pretty good at knowing what to do.
Yeah, that's true, is what they literally do as their jobs.
Yeah.
We talked about some of the action films you were looking at or effects films, but are silent films at all part of prep for something like this? Can you gain anything from that kind of storytelling?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I don't think I watched any specifically for this, but I was definitely kind of drawing on that. There's, even just in like the creature design, there's something kind of like German expressionisty about like watching that weird angular silhouette in the window. And also like Eric's character, there was definitely this kind of like Buster Keaton, Charlie Chaplin reference for him of he's wearing like a slightly oversized suit, and there's something about his physicality and the things that we put him through that like it's not exactly meant to be comical. I mean, at times he is a little bit of like a comic relief moment, but yeah, there's something about that kind of silent film physicality and the kind of humor and the drama of that we were definitely playing with.
And it makes me think about the marionette scene in the very beginning of the movie, because like you want to have them in the theater. That's important for the story, but that performance could have been anything. And there's something about that marionette and kind of the wonder of it that's completely silent. Did that come from research? Where did that come from as that being the show that they saw?
So there was this kind of running thing throughout the movie of, in a world where communication is hindered, kind of what happens to art, what happens to all those forms of communication that we cherish. I think it's kind of important that Sam's a poet, and that kind of is like language at one of its most fundamental. And so all these little moments like the magic trick and the puppet show all kind of have this resonance in that, because there are a lot of like silent moments of artistry of like people connecting in a wondrous and deep way and in an unexpected way. That puppet show, I had just been watching a lot of puppet shows on YouTube. And
just as a coincidence or as like research?
No, I knew. I mean, I hope. Maybe I was just watching a lot of puppet shows, but no, I think it was because I knew with that show I wanted something where initially it kind of feels like an eye roll, like Sam's going in and saying, "I'm going to a kids show. Is that what's going on right now? This is ridiculous. I don't want to be affected by this. I don't want to connect with this." But then sort of reluctantly she connects and then rejects it. So I knew I wanted something that kind of snuck up on you. And I thought puppets would have that kind of that feeling. And so I watched a lot of different videos, and I saw this performance by Scott Land that does a version of the sort of, it's like a classic old vaudevillian show of the clown with the balloon, and it's a special kind of rig of a puppet that can blow up a balloon, and it is usually that classic thing of they find the balloon and blow it up and start floating, and then it pops, and it's just sort of like an old staple of puppet theater. So we spent a lot of time like working with this guy Ronnie Ledrew, who's kind of the Jim Henson of London. He handled this puppet called Zippy that was like a classic children's show puppet that everyone over 40 is in love with. We had this puppet maker in London who carved the puppet out of wood, and we kind of like tailored this whole thing in a very specific way. But yeah, originally it was just kind of watching puppet shows and looking for one that kind of had that feeling that I wanted. And there was something just really appropriate about that sort of connected us to Sam, and this puppet that finds this joy and then it's cut short. And then there was also this idea of kind of evoking the like Eric's look a little bit with the puppet, because that is kind of the thing that she's going to eventually have to connect with. And he's kind of dressed as like a little like British schoolboy.
I did not think of that. That's great.
Yeah. So there was a lot of stuff that we were kind of playing with in that. And then it ends up kind of mirroring in the magic trick at the end. But yeah, I mean, at its core, it was about communication and connection, and how in a world where communication is hindered, what happens to those sort of things that we hold precious in that way, and how does art and communication how can it still be meaningful and moving, and how can we still sort of hang on to that humanity and that connection?
Is there any element for you of calling your shots, being like, okay, audience, you think you're sitting down for just like some prequel, but we're actually going to surprise you? Do you ever let yourself think that way? Yeah,
I mean, you can't do it in a totally this sort of like reactive, like, oh, I'm going to mess with you in this way. I definitely, I think in some ways the puppet show is saying that a little bit. It's like, this is a movie about a dying person getting pizza. So there's this kind of on paper, like you might be rolling your eyes, but like, it's what we're going to do is try and offer you a really human connective experience that could be really moving and emotional if you can get past your eye roll. And it's a little bit of like a challenge to the audience saying like, hey, like, if you want to open yourself up to this, give it a go. If you want to sort of see this and be like, no, I want something different, and I'm not into the quiet emotion of it, then that's fine. But like, you're not going to have the same kind of experience with it. So it's a little bit of like laying down the ground rules of like, be prepared for something hopefully like unexpectedly emotional, and that's okay if it sort of moves you.
Yeah. If you don't mind me asking a spoilery question as we wrap this up, and I can warn listeners, this is coming out next week, so hopefully people have seen it. But at the end, finding the note in the coat pocket, is that a conscious nod to Titanic or a happy coincidence?
Happy coincidence. That it. Sorry, I don't mean to disappoint, but
that's fine. I'm not disappointed. I promise.
It sort of made sense that Sam is carrying this notebook around with her the whole time. She's a poet. like, it's not exactly a poem at the end, but there's something very poetic about it. So it was just kind of this idea of her, she's found her voice again, and she's using it to connect with this person. But yeah, I was not thinking Titanic. I'm sorry.
Well, how about when you realize that Wim Wenders' Perfect Days also ends with Feeling Good, which I think they just go perfectly bookended to each other. But I don't know if there's a moment where you guys are like, damn it, Nina Simone's everywhere.
I mean, for good reason. I mean, it's an incredible song, and it really captures kind of the, it's a tricky emotion we're trying to hit at the end. Like, something kind of bleak is happening, but it's supposed to feel kind of joyful and empowering in its own way. And I think that song kind of like hits that. There's a tragedy to it, but there's also this sense of empowerment and freedom, and watching sort of Lupita just like breathe in the city air with that playing, just kind of hits the right moment.
It really is proof that like a song can mean so many different things in context. And like, that's what filmmaking is, right? Like, you put it in a different place, it means something totally different. It's lovely to see them side by side, I think.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to this week's show. This podcast is edited by Brett Fuchs and co-produced by Brett Fuchs and me. Our theme music is by Dave Gonzalez. Thanks again to my very beloved co-host, Joanna Robinson. Get the Prestige Junkie newsletter by going to theankler.com. I'll tell you that we're taking July 4th off, so new newsletters will be resuming after the holiday. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We will see you next week.